CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The African Union is going through a period of reforms, and at the heart of it is the push for self-funding. In 2017, member states started implementing the 0.2% levy on their eligible imports. However, the same year, as high as 73% of the organization's budget was still funded by external donors. So with so much reliance on external funding, is the African Union's autonomy over its agenda compromised? Also, considering that previous attempts at self-funding have all failed, will member states this time around find a predictable and sustainable solution? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now let's first take a look at the figures that go into funding the African Union. Now, budgets for the African Union vary from year to year depending on the number of ongoing programs, emergency responses and the scale of peace and security operations on the continent. In 2015, the African Union's budget stood at $393.4 million. Since then, the figure has nearly doubled. In 2018, the budget is $769.4 million US. In 2017, 73% of this budget came from external sources, particularly the European Union, while only 27% of that budget was contributions from member countries. However, in 2018, the organization is keen on cutting this figure down to 59% reliance on external sources, with member contributions up to 41%. Currently, an average of 67% of expected contributions from members is collected. Around 30 member states default either partially or completely on average. This creates a significant funding gap, hindering effective delivery, according to the African Union. Now, following that Kigali decision of 2016, member states started putting in place a 0.2% levy on eligible imports. Member contributions have since doubled from just $131.1 million US in 2015 to at least $202 million US by the end of 2017. 2018 contributions are expected to reach $318.3 million US. However, this is a far cry from the desired $1.2 billion annual sum. So what does the African Union want to do with an annual collection of $1.2 billion US? Well, the continental body aims to finance 100% of its operational budget. 75% of that will be for programs, while the African Union Peace Fund will be credited by up to 25%. Well, let's now expound on the modalities of the African Union's funding mechanism, and I'm joined by an expert panel of guests. In Ghent, in Belgium, is Geert Laporte. He's the Deputy Director of the European Centre for Development Policy Management. And joining me from Johannesburg in South Africa is Professor Shadra Guto. He's Emeritus Professor at the University of South Africa. Gentlemen, welcome to Talk Africa today. Geert, in Belgium, I'll start off with you, and I want to bring up some statistics here on the current funding situation between the European Union and the African Union. In 2017, though, 27% of AU funding was from member states, but about 73% was from international partners. The EU funding annually is on average 60% of the AU's budget. How would you characterize this relationship between the European Union and the African Union? Is it a partnership? Is it paternalistic? Is it a donor-recipient dynamic?
Well, it is definitely still an aid-dependency relationship. It is not normal that the legal and most important African institutions are still paid by donors, including in the first place by the European Union. But we have come a long way, and I think we are on track to change that system. What is needed at this moment is that African member states try to mobilize their own funding, their own resources, so as to have fully independent institutions that can become more assertive in global affairs and also in the relationship with the European Union. And this is something which is at this moment becoming more promising, since we have the so-called Kaberuka plan that foresees 0.2 levy on imports from outside the African region.
We're going to get into the current funding mechanism in just a moment, but I do want to get Professor Guto's view here on what is the current European Union, African Union funding situation. How do you see that partnership?
Well, I don't feel proud as an African, because I think of the 55 countries in Africa, many of them are very rich in minerals, in oil, in mining sector and everything else. And we can do a lot for ourselves, but we are used after independence. Each one of the countries, as soon as they became independent, they remained tied to their former colonial masters. And I think that's part of the weakness, so that the donor syndrome is still very strong within the heads of state and government in Africa. And their advisors, I must say, because we also should have a voice. But if we look at the relationship, we must say that unless our leaders get together and talk frankly and begin to see what they can do, we do have peace and security.
I'm going to drop in. I'm going to go to Gert now and get Gert's reaction here, Professor Guto. Gert, what exactly is the interest of the European Union when it comes to funding? I mean, it is giving about 73% of that funding to the African Union in 2017 alone.
Well, the European Union, of course, wants to have an influence in Africa, and we always have had that influence through all types of arrangements. I would say the relics of the colonial past have been the Lomé Conventions and also the current Cotonou Agreement, which is an agreement between the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific. You could call it the last colonies of the European strongest colonizing countries. But this is the past. We should move on. And I can't agree more with Professor Guto. I think he's saying the right things. At this very moment, it is important that Africa takes its own fate in its own hands through strong institutions. And of course, Europe has an interest. Europe has a very strong interest, and it has made that interest very clear. What does Europe want? It wants stability. It is afraid of terrorism. And it wants to contain the migration waves. At the same time, there's also a major fear that the demographic explosion in Africa will not necessarily be leading to more jobs in Africa, which again would lead to more risks of massive migration towards the European continent. So there's a clear interest in the European Union side to have a strong partnership with Africa.
Right.
The question is, of course, now, what type of partnership is the best partnership?
Right. Just let me come back to you in a minute. Professor Guto, the European Union wants stability, wants to stem terrorism and stem migration across the borders. What are African interests? Where is Africa's voice here? Is this what Africa wants as well?
Well, I think the problem that Africa is having in terms of refugee outflow to Europe, which is very risky indeed. Part of it was caused by Europe and the US when they destroyed Libya. They murdered Muammar Gaddafi, who used to fund the AU quite a lot. And I think that those are things we must look at and be able to say Europe is partly to blame for fueling conflict on the continent, selling arms on the continent to rebels, to governments, and so on. So Europe cannot say that it has no interest. And besides that, of course, the European Union countries have heavy investments in Africa. And I think a lot of what they manufacture, most of them are now being manufactured in Africa, and then the profits go to Europe, and Europe renews itself while Africa is being underdeveloped. So I think we need to take ourselves seriously, and we need to talk to our leaders and our intellectuals to be able to find a path forward here.
Get the whole question of Libya, it was one of those issues where Africa lost out as they were trying to go for a dialogue. NATO allies unilaterally made a decision to bomb Libya. Now that Libya is in a mess, who's fixing Libya?
Well, I fully agree again with Professor Gutto that Libya was definitely an action that was not supported by the African side, by the African Union. It was a unilateral decision by the Western countries, including some European Union member states. It was a mistake. I think it never should have happened. If you now look at the chaos in Libya, I think Professor Gutto is fully right that Europe is to blame to a large extent for what is happening and what has happened in Libya. On the other hand, I feel, however, that on the African side more could be done to break away from this asymmetric relationship. I think on the African side there is a need for more leadership to say, look, do we let this happen on our continent? Do we want own strong institutions that are fully independent and that can get into a strong dialogue based on real common interest with the European Union? And this is something which is not happening yet. We see it when there are trade negotiations such as the economic partnership agreements. Europe defines the agenda, Europe sets the agenda, and Europe hardly makes concessions. Why? Because there is no counterpart that is at this moment strong enough to tell the European side to shut up. But I would say that there are some signs of hope. There are some triggers that we notice. First of all, there is the fact that the African Union is now really looking into own funding systems. And I also believe that the rise of other global players in Africa, including China, but not only China, there's a whole range of other players, will give the African side much more leeway and much more flexibility to choose its partners. And this makes, of course, Europe nervous. And it leads to different types of relations in the medium and longer term.
Europe may be becoming nervous, but with all this funding going to the African Union, with all this funding having, dated back over 50 years, is Europe now starting to feel like Africa is becoming a financial burden? Gert.
It is definitely an issue in many European member states, because you have to know that those who had a colonial past are now a minority. And with the exit of the British, there's only very few countries that have had a colonial past in Africa. So of the 27 remaining EU member states, there's at least 20 who do not have any colonial relationship with Africa. So they do not necessarily agree with the strong focus that Europe has on Africa. And I think this is a factor to be taken into account. I also believe that it is not easy to change old practices and old habits on both sides. And I refer to the Cotonou Agreement, this old-fashioned ACP-EU development cooperation aid type of agreement with a lot of aid money. This is not longer sustainable, but it is still to be renegotiated by both parties because there are strong vested interests. Aid has created addiction on both sides of the partnership.
Professor Gutto, two things have arisen here. Africa is letting Europe accept the agenda and then making the complaint. Your view?
Well, I think Africa cannot be high up on the agenda of Europe. I think that the US and so on are very close. They are North Atlantic Treaty Organization that they are using across the seas, and it is the instrument that is being used to be able to terrorize some countries or to be able to murder African leaders who were thinking in an African manner, like Thomas Sankara, people like Samora Machel, like Kwame Nkrumah, and we can name a lot of them. So I think these are part of the problem that Africa has, but also I think our leaders must take responsibility. The level of poverty, inequality, underdevelopment, we cannot blame all of it on Europe. I think we have to take part of the share of the blame that we are not taking ourselves seriously enough to make Africa rise again.
Right.
Africa Renaissance requires that Africa rises and Pan-Africanism is built and made very strong.
All right, Professor Shadrach Guto and Geert Laporte, do stay with us for a moment. We'll continue with this discussion, but for now, we're taking a short break. And when we return, we'll have more on the African Union's drive towards an independent funding mechanism. Do stay with us.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, in May of 2017, a newly appointed African Union Reform Committee sat in Kigali, Rwanda, to discuss ways of reinventing the organization towards a self-sufficient, adequate, and sustainable future. Now, chairing that meeting was Rwanda's President Paul Kagame, who rallied the continent to realize independent funding of the African Union. Let's take a listen.
This is first and foremost a choice to no longer be dependent on outsiders. That is the principle at stake. It's really about the value we attach to being effective and self-reliant as an organization, as a continent. This process is not about what each country can do on its own, but rather what we can all do together for each other and with each other.
Well, that's Paul Kagame, Rwandan president there. The African Union Commission Chair, Musa Faki Mahamat, has also reiterated the need for financing the African Union. He said, and I quote, "Financing of the African Union is crucial, even existential for the future of our union." So we have all recognized the importance and necessity of funding our union. So Professor Guto, can Africa do this? Is Africa able to fund itself?
Africa can do it, but we live in a globalized world, and because of that, other countries, particularly the rich ones that have been exploiting Africa for the last 500 years, also have a responsibility to make a contribution under the paradigm of the new partnership for Africa's development. We need to do that, but we have to concentrate on important areas like infrastructure development so that there's movement of goods, services, labor, culture, and so on across the continent. If we don't do that, we are not going to get very far. And then to start projects of industrialization, I think that we can be able to do much, much better than we are doing. But we can't be left alone to say, do it yourself, as if the others did it without exploiting Africa among other regions in the world.
Right. Gert, from where you sit, though, do you see the African Union actually being able to finance itself? Do you think the 0.2% levy is a viable option?
Well, there are already a number of countries that are at this moment implementing this 0.2 levy on goods from outside the region. So I think that's a positive sign. There's a number of other countries that still have to implement this, but the Kaberuka report is definitely an impressive step forward to ensure sustainable, flexible types of funding. And this is the first step, I would say. Once you have independent, strong institutions, you can play your role in the relationship with Europe, but definitely also on global affairs. If Africa would have to negotiate, for example, a place in or a seat in the UN Security Council, you need to have independent institutions. If it wants to strike deals on climate, you need to have credible independent institutions. So I believe that this is a very important first step towards other types of frameworks of cooperation beyond the traditional donor-recipient relationship which we have known under the Lomé and the Cotonou Agreement, which was purely an aid relationship creating vested interests on both sides of the partnership. So we are on track, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I agree with Professor Guto that there is a lot of resources available in Africa, and I also agree that Africa should be able to count on its partners, not only the European Union, but also other partners, to bring about this development.
Right, Professor Guto, though, because Gert is talking about the need for Africa to be part of those institutions or those organizations that do actually make global decisions. So why is Africa not part of that yet?
Well, first of all, I think we should not just think of Africa and Europe. The United Nations organization was set up, and it has heavy bureaucracy that is paid so much. Some of it can be cut down, and some of the resources really channeled to countries that are still relatively less developed or underdeveloped, and many of them are in Africa. Secondly, I think we need to change our paradigm of thinking. Self-reliance, self-reliance, self-reliance. If it requires that there be maybe a special tax of the middle class in Africa, who number, hundreds of millions, if you just tax them each about the equivalent of 10 US dollars once off, the amount that you will collect is very huge and can go to do a lot. We have the Agenda 2063, but that agenda is limping because we are not having innovative ways of raising resources, but also wiping out corruption. And because some of the money that is coming to Africa in form of aid, a lot of it is being channeled outside through corrupt practices.
Professor Guto, as we talk about other avenues, there is this avenue of the 0.2% levy. But when we look at the traditional way of Africa, the African Union collecting revenue, 33 of African countries, of the 54, 55 African countries have actually been defaulters of that system. So how do we make African countries conform?
We have to talk truth to our leaders and urge them to be able to wake up, because the world is laughing at Africa. As I already indicated, we are a very rich continent. And if we were to galvanize our forces, we have intellectual capital in Africa. They are spread all over the world, being used elsewhere, but not on our continent, because our leaders sometimes are afraid of people who think critically and make good patriotic suggestions that can really drive the Africa agenda forward. So I think, yes, it can be done, but it needs pressure from below, not just relying on politicians. They won't do it voluntarily. There should be pressure, and citizens must be able to indicate that they want to control resources in their countries, and they don't want this to be siphoned off. The study which was done by President Thabo Mbeki, which is entitled IFP, Illegal Flight of Funds from Africa or monies from Africa, is much larger than what Africa receives from outside in terms of so-called donor gifts and so on. What is going out is much, much more than that. And those are the really pillars on which we can build, and it can be done.
All right, Gert, a final comment from you though. If the African Union does become 100% self-funding, will this give it more ownership in implementation of its programs?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the recipe that always works. If you pay yourself for your own institution, you will definitely take ownership. You will believe in the role of your own institution. So that's a real precondition. But let me tell you that what we've had in the past was that Europe was imposing for its aid money unilateral conditionalities, and this has never worked. This is not healthy. This creates dependency. But what we need is indeed a kind of peer pressure amongst African Union member states to comply with the commitments that have been made and to implement what has been agreed. And this can only be done by peer pressure amongst African heads of state, amongst African states, including on issues that we did not discuss today, but issues that relate very much to opening up societies in Africa. Because also there is huge challenges if we will have to cope with the big demographic explosion, jobs for young people, younger generations. We will probably need to open up societies, and we will probably need to give more opportunities to business and to civil society and social economic actors. But this is again not a role that can be played by an external force. It's definitely not by a colonial external force like the European Union. It should be settled internally within the African Union itself. But I would say that also there I see some signs of hope. I see some signs of improvement. There is again this wish within the African group of heads of states to raise own funding and so as to be more accountable themselves for their own resources, which is a good thing, because if you are dependent up to the level of payment of your peacekeeping troops, if you are dependent on all this of the European Union funding, this is not healthy. But the African component in Africa peace operations is growing.
Well, those are a very insightful thoughts indeed, Gert Laporte and Professor Guto. We'll leave it there for the moment, because that's all we have time for this week. And thank you to my guests for your insight. Gert Laporte in Belgium, Deputy Director of the European Centre for Development Policy Management, and in Johannesburg, South Africa, Professor Shadrack Guto, Emeritus Professor at the University of South Africa. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback, and do keep the conversation going online through our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, it's goodbye.